Faith begins where human strength ends, and the moment a setback appears is often the exact moment faith is required to operate at its highest level. Many people misunderstand setbacks because they judge them by what they feel and see instead of by what God has already spoken. A setback is never proof that God has withdrawn His hand. It is often evidence that you are moving in the right direction. If there were no resistance, there would be no need for faith, and if there were no faith, there would be no manifestation of God's power. The spiritual secret is learning to respond correctly when circumstances contradict the promise. Faith does not deny the existence of pressure, but it refuses to give pressure the final word. Natural thinking says a setback is failure, but faith recognizes it as a signal that something greater is being prepared. The enemy always tries to interrupt what God has already authorized. He does not attack what has no future, and he does not resist what has no impact. When opposition increases, it is often because the breakthrough is already closer than it appears. Many believers collapse under pressure because they were never taught how faith actually works. They believe faith is hoping things improve, waiting for feelings to change, or praying repeatedly for God to do something He has already promised. Faith is not passive. Faith is active. Faith speaks. Faith stands. Faith acts on the word even when the situation looks worse instead of better. The real test of faith is not when everything is going well, but when nothing seems to be changing. Setbacks are designed to move you out of reliance on the natural realm and into total dependence on the Word. As long as you can fix something yourself, faith often stays quiet, but when your ability reaches its limit, faith has room to operate. That is why pressure feels uncomfortable. It forces a decision. Either you will trust what you see, or you will trust what God said. You cannot do both at the same time. The mistake many people make is interpreting delay as denial. They assume that because results did not come immediately, God must not be involved. But faith understands timing. Faith understands process. Faith understands that what happens in the spirit realm often precedes what shows up in the natural realm. Just because you cannot see movement does not mean nothing is happening. Some of the most important work is invisible before it becomes visible. A setback exposes your confession. Under pressure, whatever you truly believe comes out of your mouth. Words reveal whether faith is present or whether fear has taken over. Complaining may feel natural, but it strengthens the very thing you are trying to escape. Silence may feel safe, but it allows doubt to grow unchecked. Faith-filled words, spoken consistently, align you with what God has already established. The spiritual secret is not avoiding setbacks, but refusing to let them redefine you. Circumstances are temporary, but the Word is eternal. Feelings fluctuate, but truth remains the same. Faith is not pretending everything is fine. Faith is declaring that God's Word is greater than the current condition. Faith does not speak what is happening. It speaks what is promised. Every setback is an opportunity to reinforce your stand. When pressure increases, your foundation is tested. If your confidence is built on circumstances, it will collapse. But if it is built on the Word, it will hold. God never promised the absence of challenges, but He did promise victory to those who believe. Faith does not ask for evidence before standing. Faith stands because God has already spoken. Setbacks often reveal areas where adjustment is needed. This is not condemnation, it is preparation. Sometimes faith must be refined. Sometimes patience must be developed. Sometimes obedience must be sharpened. None of this means failure. It means growth. What feels like resistance is often God strengthening you for what is ahead. Faith understands that pressure produces endurance, and endurance produces stability. Stability keeps you from being moved by every report, every opinion, every delay. When you become stable in faith, setbacks lose their emotional power. You stop reacting and start responding. You stop panicking and start declaring. You stop questioning God and start standing on His Word. Another part of the secret is recognizing that God often uses setbacks to reposition you. What looks like a closed door may be protection. What feels like a loss may be a redirection. Faith trusts God's wisdom even when the path does not make sense. You may not understand why something ended, but faith knows that God never removes something without having something better prepared. Faith does not demand explanations. Faith demands alignment. When you align your words, your thoughts, and your actions with the Word, the setback begins to serve you instead of stopping you. What was meant to discourage you becomes the very thing that strengthens your resolve. What was meant to delay you becomes the training ground for your next level. The enemy thrives on emotional responses. Fear weakens faith. Discouragement drains strength. Confusion clouds judgment. Faith counters all of this with truth. The word spoken in faith brings clarity, peace, and direction. That is why speaking the word in adversity is not optional, it is essential. Heaven responds to faith-filled words, not emotional reactions. Setbacks do not mean you are behind schedule. God's plan is not fragile. It does not fall apart because of resistance. His purposes are resilient. They move forward even through obstacles. Faith partners with that resilience. Faith refuses to quit. Faith refuses to retreat. Faith refuses to lower its expectation just because the process became uncomfortable. There is a divine setup hidden inside every setback, but it can only be accessed by faith. Natural reasoning cannot see it. Feelings cannot detect it. Only faith recognizes that God is still working even when the situation looks unchanged. Faith understands that pressure often precedes promotion, resistance often precedes release, and testing often precedes testimony. When you learn this secret, setbacks stop intimidating you. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" And you start declaring, "This is working for my good." You recognize that nothing is wasted in God's economy. Every challenge has purpose. Every delay has direction. Every setback carries the potential for advancement. Faith does not wait for conditions to improve before standing firm. Faith stands firm so conditions can improve. The setup begins the moment you refuse to move off the word. Heaven honors consistency. Heaven responds to endurance. Heaven moves on behalf of those who will not let go of what God has spoken. The spiritual secret is simple but powerful. Stay anchored in the Word when everything else feels unstable. Keep your confession steady when emotions fluctuate. Remain confident in God's faithfulness when circumstances are loud. What you stand on in adversity determines what you step into next. Setbacks are not interruptions to God's plan. They are often instruments within it. Faith matures when it is forced to operate beyond comfort and convenience. When everything is smooth, faith stays theoretical. But when resistance shows up, faith must become practical. The real issue is never the setback itself, but how the believer responds to it. Faith is revealed under pressure, not in the absence of it. The natural mind immediately looks for causes, blame, and explanations. It wants to know who failed, what went wrong, and how long the situation will last. Faith operates on a different level. Faith looks to the Word first, not to the problem. Faith understands that God's promises do not change just because circumstances do. The promise was true before the setback appeared, and it remains true while the setback is present. One of the greatest misunderstandings in spiritual life is the belief that faith eliminates challenges. Faith does not remove opposition, it overcomes it. Resistance does not mean you are outside God's will. Many times, resistance is proof that you are walking directly in line with it. If faith were unnecessary, pressure would never come. The presence of opposition means there is something worth opposing. Setbacks test whether your confidence is rooted in results or in God's Word. If your confidence depends on quick answers, it will collapse under delay. But if it is anchored in truth, it will remain steady regardless of timing. Faith does not need immediate evidence to continue believing. Faith draws its assurance from what God has already said. Pressure has a way of exposing inner dialogue. When things go wrong, thoughts become loud. Fear suggests failure. Doubt questions whether faith is working at all. Discouragement whispers that nothing will ever change. Faith must answer these voices with the Word. If thoughts are left unchecked, they will eventually shape words, and words shape direction. The spiritual secret lies in maintaining spiritual authority in adverse conditions. Authority is exercised through words. What you declare consistently reveals who you believe is in control. When setbacks arise, the temptation is to speak from emotion. Emotion speaks from the present problem. Faith speaks from eternal truth. The moment you shift your language, you shift your alignment. Faith understands that unseen movement often precedes visible change. Just because you cannot trace what God is doing does not mean He is doing nothing. Many breakthroughs are delayed, not denied. The delay allows faith to deepen, endurance to grow, and dependence on God to become complete rather than partial. Setbacks are often used to detach believers from self-reliance. As long as human strength seems sufficient, faith remains secondary. But when human ability reaches its limit, faith must take the lead. This is uncomfortable for the flesh, but necessary for spiritual growth. God is not trying to break you. He is teaching you to trust Him completely. There is also a refining process that happens during setbacks. Motives are purified, expectations are corrected, focus is sharpened. Faith becomes less about outcomes and more about obedience. When faith reaches this level, it becomes unshakable. External circumstances lose their power to control internal peace. Another key element of the secret is perseverance. Faith is not proven by a strong start, but by a steady stand. Anyone can believe when results appear quickly. Mature faith believes when nothing seems to be happening. Endurance is not passive waiting, it is active confidence. It is holding the same confession day after day, regardless of what the situation suggests. Setbacks often come with voices from outside as well. Opinions, advice, and well-meaning concern can weaken faith if allowed too much influence. Faith must learn to filter what it hears. Not every report deserves attention. The Word must remain the loudest voice. When the Word is central, peace follows, even in uncertainty. God's plan is never threatened by resistance. His purposes are established beyond human interference. Faith aligns with that certainty. Instead of seeing setbacks as signs of failure, faith sees them as moments of positioning. What appears to slow progress may actually be preventing greater loss or preparing for greater responsibility. Faith also recognizes that growth often requires discomfort. Muscles do not develop without resistance. In the same way, spiritual strength increases when faith is exercised under pressure. A setback is not meant to weaken you, it is meant to train you. What you learn during resistance equips you for future victories. One of the most dangerous reactions to setbacks is impatience. Impatience leads to compromise. Compromise leads to regret. Faith refuses shortcuts. Faith understands that God's timing is part of His wisdom. Rushing ahead of God can be more damaging than waiting on Him. Trusting the process protects the promise. Another layer of the secret is gratitude. Gratitude in adversity is not denial, it is alignment. When you thank God in the middle of a setback, you acknowledge His sovereignty. Gratitude keeps the heart soft and receptive. It prevents bitterness from taking root. A thankful heart remains open to instruction and direction. Faith also requires consistency in action. While waiting, you continue doing what God last instructed. You do not abandon obedience just because results are delayed. Setbacks do not cancel responsibility. Faith stays faithful in small things, trusting that promotion comes from God, not from circumstances. The pressure of a setback often tempts people to lower their expectations. They settle for survival instead of victory. Faith refuses to shrink its vision. God's promises are not adjusted downward because of difficulty. Faith keeps its expectation high, not based on circumstances, but based on God's character. As faith grows, fear loses influence. Fear thrives in uncertainty, but faith brings clarity. Even when the outcome is unseen, faith provides stability. You may not know how or when things will change, but you know who you trust. That knowledge brings peace that circumstances cannot remove. Setbacks become setups when faith remains steady. The moment you refuse to quit, refuse to complain, and refuse to compromise, the situation begins to serve a different purpose. What was meant to discourage you starts developing strength within you. What was meant to stop you starts positioning you for something greater. Faith is not a temporary reaction to trouble, it is a lifestyle. When faith becomes your default response, setbacks lose their intimidation. They no longer define your direction or determine your outcome. Faith keeps you moving forward even when progress is not immediately visible. The spiritual secret is not found in avoiding hardship, but in responding correctly to it. When faith governs your words, thoughts, and actions, every setback becomes part of a larger setup designed for growth, maturity, and eventual victory. Setbacks often arrive unannounced, and when they do, they challenge not only circumstances but convictions. What determines the outcome is not the pressure itself, but the spiritual posture you maintain while under it. Faith is not measured by how loudly one celebrates in success, but by how firmly one stands when nothing appears to be working. The real work of faith begins when the evidence contradicts the promise. Many believers assume that faith should prevent hardship, but faith was never designed to eliminate challenges. Faith was designed to overcome them. Resistance does not mean you are off course. Very often it means you are directly in line with what God has already planned. Opposition is not proof of failure. It is often confirmation that your direction matters. Setbacks expose the foundation upon which confidence is built. If confidence is rooted in visible progress, it will collapse under delay. But if it is rooted in the Word, it will remain unshaken regardless of circumstances. Faith draws strength from what God has spoken, not from what can be immediately observed. What is seen is temporary. What God has said is eternal. One of the hidden dangers of setbacks is discouragement. Discouragement slowly erodes expectation. It does not arrive suddenly, but gradually through unanswered questions and prolonged waiting. Faith must be intentionally guarded during these seasons. The mind must be renewed daily, not occasionally. If thoughts are not aligned with truth, they will eventually align with fear. The spiritual secret is learning how to respond internally before responding externally. Before faith ever speaks, it must settle the heart. Anxiety, frustration, and confusion all compete for attention during pressure. Faith quiets the soul by returning to the certainty of God's character. God is faithful regardless of how the situation feels. He does not change His mind because circumstances change. Setbacks often confront believers with the temptation to quit quietly, not by dramatic rebellion, but by slowly lowering spiritual standards, reducing expectation, and becoming comfortable with less than what was promised. Faith resists this subtle retreat. Faith holds its position. Faith does not back down simply because the process is longer than expected. Another dimension of the secret is endurance. Endurance is faith stretched over time. It is not passive waiting, but active trust. It is waking up each day with the same confidence, even when the environment remains unchanged. Endurance refuses to let temporary discomfort dictate permanent decisions. Faith understands that God often works in layers. What you see on the surface is rarely the whole story. While you are dealing with visible resistance, God may be aligning people, resources, and opportunities behind the scenes. The absence of visible progress does not equal the absence of divine activity. Setbacks also test obedience. It is easy to obey when the path is clear and the rewards are immediate. But true obedience continues even when clarity is limited. Faith does not require full understanding to remain obedient. It trusts that God sees what you cannot and knows what you do not. The way a believer speaks during a setback reveals spiritual maturity. Words spoken in frustration may feel justified, but they weaken faith. Faith-filled words may feel unnatural, but they reinforce truth. The tongue can either anchor you to the promise or tie you to the problem. Speaking the word in adversity is an act of spiritual authority. The enemy uses setbacks as opportunities to suggest doubt. He questions identity, purpose, and calling. Faith answers these suggestions with truth. You do not debate doubt, you replace it. The word spoken consistently builds an inner resistance to fear. Over time, confidence grows not because circumstances improved, but because faith was exercised. Another aspect of the secret is perspective. Faith sees beyond the moment. It views setbacks as temporary conditions, not permanent conclusions. Perspective keeps the heart from becoming bitter. Bitterness hardens the heart and blocks spiritual growth. Faith chooses trust over resentment, even when answers are delayed. God often uses setbacks to correct direction without destroying destiny. What feels like loss may actually be protection. What appears to be failure may be preparation. Faith trusts God's wisdom in redirecting paths. A closed door does not mean rejection. It often means refinement or redirection. Setbacks can also expose misplaced priorities. When something is taken away or delayed, it reveals how much weight was placed on it. Faith realigns priorities by placing God's will above personal preference. When faith reaches this level, peace becomes independent of outcomes. Patience is a vital companion to faith. Faith believes God can. Patience trusts God will. Impatience attempts to force results prematurely. Faith waits without weakening. It does not rush ahead of God, nor does it lag behind in obedience. Setbacks challenge the believer to choose consistency over convenience. Faith is built through repeated decisions to trust, not through single dramatic moments. Daily faithfulness during pressure develops spiritual resilience. Over time, what once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. Another layer of the secret is humility. Setbacks remind believers of their dependence on God. Pride resists reliance. Faith embraces it. When self-sufficiency is stripped away, faith has room to grow stronger. God does not resist humble faith. He responds to it. Setbacks also refine discernment. Not every opportunity is beneficial. Not every open door is from God. Faith learns to wait for God's timing rather than chasing quick relief. Discernment protects the believer from decisions driven by desperation. As faith matures, reactions change. Panic gives way to peace. Complaining gives way to confession. Confusion gives way to clarity. This transformation does not happen instantly, but gradually as faith is consistently exercised. The spiritual secret is not found in avoiding hardship, but in allowing faith to govern every response within it. When faith becomes the controlling force, setbacks lose their power to define identity or determine destiny. They become temporary assignments rather than permanent limitations. Faith does not ignore reality, it interprets reality through the Word. When faith leads, the setback becomes a classroom rather than a prison. Lessons learned in pressure become tools for future success. What once seemed unbearable becomes evidence of growth. What once felt like defeat becomes proof of endurance. Faith remains steady, confident that God is faithful, His word is true, and His purpose continues to unfold even when the path is challenging. Setbacks often arrive at moments when expectations are high and confidence feels justified. They interrupt momentum and challenge assumptions about how progress should look. What determines whether a setback becomes a stumbling block or a stepping stone is the spiritual response that follows. Faith does not panic when plans are disrupted. Faith recognizes that God's purpose is not fragile and does not collapse under pressure. Many people confuse comfort with confirmation. When everything is easy, they assume they are in the center of God's will. When difficulty appears, they assume something has gone wrong. Faith does not rely on ease as evidence of divine approval. Faith relies on the unchanging truth of God's Word. God's will is not measured by how smooth the path feels, but by how closely it aligns with what He has spoken. The nature of faith is revealed when control is removed. Setbacks strip away the illusion of control and expose the need for trust. This is uncomfortable for the natural mind, which prefers predictability and clear outcomes. Faith operates without needing all the details. It trusts the character of God when the future feels uncertain. Setbacks often reveal where identity has been placed. If identity is rooted in success, approval, or outcomes, a setback will shake it. Faith anchors identity in God alone. When identity is secure, circumstances lose their power to define worth or direction. A believer who knows who they are can endure seasons where progress seems hidden. One of the most important aspects of the spiritual secret is learning to remain spiritually active during delay. Delay tempts people to disengage, to do less, pray less, expect less. Faith does the opposite. Faith remains consistent. It continues to believe, speak, and obey even when results are postponed. Consistency in faith keeps the heart aligned with God's promises. Setbacks are often accompanied by emotional fatigue. Waiting can wear down enthusiasm and drain motivation. Faith does not deny these feelings, but it refuses to be led by them. Faith acknowledges emotion but submits it to truth. Strength is renewed not by changing circumstances, but by renewing the mind. Another part of the secret is recognizing that God often develops depth before He releases increase. Depth produces stability. Stability sustains growth. Without depth, increase can become destructive. Setbacks slow the pace so that character can catch up with calling. Faith understands that preparation is as important as manifestation. Setbacks also confront expectations. Sometimes expectations are sincere but inaccurate. Faith allows God to adjust expectations without losing trust. What you expected may not be what God intended. Faith releases personal timelines and embraces divine order. The enemy often uses setbacks to accuse, suggesting that past mistakes disqualified you or that failure defines you. Faith rejects accusation and embraces redemption. God's grace is not canceled by setbacks. Redemption is not fragile. Faith stands firm in righteousness, not in personal performance. Another dimension of the secret is the discipline of focus. During adversity, attention is easily drawn to what is missing, what failed, or what hurts. Faith redirects focus to what remains true. Focus determines emotional strength. When focus is fixed on the promise, peace follows. Setbacks require spiritual discernment. Not every delay is an attack. Not every obstacle is opposition. Some are instruction. Some are protection. Faith seeks God's wisdom rather than assuming the worst. Discernment prevents unnecessary battles and preserves strength. Patience works alongside faith to keep the heart steady. Patience is not resignation. It is confident endurance. It holds the same expectation without frustration. Faith without patience becomes impulsive. Patience without faith becomes passive. Together they produce stability. Setbacks also refine prayer. Prayer moves from requests to relationship. In seasons of delay, believers often learn to seek God more deeply rather than merely seeking outcomes. Faith matures when God becomes the focus rather than the result. Another layer of the secret is obedience in obscurity. When progress is visible, obedience feels rewarding. When obedience goes unnoticed, faith must supply motivation. God often tests faith in hidden places before promoting it publicly. What is done faithfully in private prepares for public responsibility. Setbacks challenge the believer to trust God's timing over personal urgency. Urgency pressures decisions. Faith waits for instruction. Acting too quickly can undo what patience is building. Faith understands that God's timing is precise, not delayed. Fear often surfaces during setbacks, presenting worst-case scenarios. Faith counters fear by returning to truth. Fear asks what if. Faith declares what is. Fear imagines loss. Faith affirms promise. The battle is often internal before it is external. Another part of the secret is learning to rest spiritually. Rest does not mean inactivity. It means freedom from anxiety. Faith rests in the assurance that God is at work even when progress is slow. Rest preserves strength and prevents burnout. Setbacks also develop compassion. Experiencing difficulty increases empathy for others. Faith does not isolate in hardship. It grows in understanding. Compassion shapes character and deepens ministry effectiveness. As faith grows through setbacks, reactions change. Resistance no longer produces panic. Delay no longer produces despair. Faith becomes calm, steady, and resilient. This resilience is not natural. It is cultivated through repeated trust. The spiritual secret is that setbacks cannot stop what God has ordained unless faith is abandoned. God's purpose continues to unfold through resistance, delay, and uncertainty. When faith remains engaged, every setback becomes part of a greater setup, shaping maturity, strengthening trust, and aligning the believer with God's perfect plan.